First of all, thank you all for coming. And let me thank the organizers for the invitation. And I go straight to the point. For many years, the British Ministry of Defense carried a historical note on their website, which in short read the following. Few countries can trace the course of their history over 10,000 years, but in approximately 8,000 BC, the island of Cyprus was already inhabited and going through its Neolithic age. The island's strategic position, its copper deposits, and its timber attracted the first Greeks who came to the island over 3,000 years ago at the end of the Trojan Wars. They settled down, bringing with them and establishing the Greek identity. Cyprus gained its independence in 1960 for the first time in 3,500 years, but the Greek identity of language and culture has been retained. Two barbaric Turkish invasions on 20th July and 14 August 1974 left half of the Republic of Cyprus under Turkish military occupation, almost 200,000 Greek Cypriots refugees, intentionally uprooted and replaced by equal number and more of illegal settlers from Anatolia for demographic change, a war crime, 1619 missing, hundreds killed and hundreds of women of all ages raped, and 37% of the territory of a sovereign country member of the United Nations, the Commonwealth, and since 2004, the European Union, under invasion and occupation for 42 years. And yet the solution under negotiation, instead of one of decent and just liberation, one of respect for the rule of law, human rights and dignity for all, is an odious segregationist bi-communal Bi-zonal Federation based on the racist bi-communalism of the Ottoman millet system of centuries past. In his book of memoirs, 6 Presidential Portraits, Mr. Kostas Hadjikostis, the executive director of Cyprus's second biggest media group, Dias, poses the most exhaustive and depressing result of contemporary Cypriot history. How did Cyprus manage to survive 300 years of Turkish enslavement and retain the Greekness, and in 50 years of a free, I would say in inverted commas, political life, is heading back towards complete Turkish takeover? For one to understand, however, the how and why, one needs to go back in history. In 1908, the British colonial power built a railway line running across the island from Famagusta to almost reaching Morpho Bay, and which lasted until 1951. The significance of this map and that railway line, ironically, will reflect events years later. On 1st April 1955, a guerrilla war broke out in Cyprus against the colonial regime by EOGA, National Organization of Cypriot Fighters, sworn to fight for union of Cyprus with Greece, self-determination. On 15 January 1950, the people of Cyprus, in a plebiscite organized by the Church of Cyprus, had decided by 97% for union with Greece, but Britain refused to accept it. The British response to EOGA was to bring back Turkey as an interested party to the Cyprus problem through the Tripartite Conference in London, end of August 1955, contrary to the provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne, by which Turkey had in 1923 relinquished all rights to Cyprus. According to Professor Robert Holland of King's College London, and contrary to claims, there was no NATO interference in the Cyprus problem in the 1950s, because the American Secretary Foster Dulles feared that that might sharpen already divisive tendencies among the countries concerned. This is in his book, Britain and the Revolt in Cyprus, 1954-1955. On 3rd of May 1956, however, Foster Dulles warned the British government that unless it took steps to improve the situation, NATO was bound to step in. It is of great historical importance to record here the sequence of British and Turkish activities which sealed the fate of Cyprus between the time of this warning and 19 December 1956. On June 18, 1956, London presented Turkey with a secret plan for a constitution which provided for a treaty between the United Kingdom, Greece and Turkey. At the end of 10 years from the constitution coming into effect, Her Majesty's government would raise with their fellow members of NATO the question whether a change in the status of Cyprus would be compatible with the interest of Western defense. The plan included a plebiscite. Ankara government rejected the plan, and the British Prime Minister on 12 July 1956 announced the establishment of Lord Radcliffe's Constitutional Commission to draw up a liberal constitution for the island. The statement did not reveal the substance of the June plan, that the Turkish government had rejected it and that it was never put to the Greek government. Sir John Harding, the governor of Cyprus, was instructed to prepare partition plans. Harding regarded partition as a confession of failure, but adhered to orders. The various schemes studied were sent to London on 12 November 1956, and on the 30th November 1956, the chiefs of staff rejected them. Now, that was the study that came to London from Nicosia. On 13 October 1956, the New York Times reported from London that a plan for the partition of Cyprus into Greek and Turkish zones was gradually winning support. It wrote, the partition plan would involve bisecting Cyprus along a line running roughly from Limassol on the south coast to the vicinity of Lapithos on the north, concentrating the ethnic Turks who total about 100,000 compared with roughly 400,000 ethnic Greeks into the Turkish half of Cyprus. At the time, and now, the Greeks composed of 82% of the population of Cyprus and the Turks 18%. In parallel, in the autumn of 1956, the Turkish Prime Minister commissioned Turkish constitutionalist Dr. Nihaderim to draft a plan for the recapture of Cyprus, one of two reports delivered on 24 November 1956. These reports were first made known to us in the 1980s by late Professor of Sociology of History Neoklis Saris in his book The Other Side. In an academic article on Nihaderim's 1956 paper on Cyprus, published in 2014 in the Journal of Modern Turkish History Studies by Hikmet Zeki Kapsi, the writer confirms that Erim's policy over Cyprus is followed to the letter to this very day by consecutive Turkish governments. Erim's main arguments were that Turkey's geographical, historical, and strategic rights over Cyprus were logical. If the British and the Americans did not want the balance of power as set out in the Lausanne Treaty to be disturbed, Cyprus should never be given to Greece, but only to Turkey. Otherwise, Turkey would raise issues over some of the Aegean islands, Western Thrace, the Patriarchate, and Greeks in Constantinople. Dr. Erim referred also to British partition plans and supported the idea of halving Cyprus into two and of self-determination, but in a communal segregationist form and not to the people of the island as a whole. Concentrating all the Greeks in one area to govern themselves was not a pointless hardship. This was necessary in order to avoid violating the rights to self-determination of the Turkish community, he claimed. A classic example of Turkish twisting and manipulating of principles to suit Turkish interests. On 4th December, Turkish Prime Minister Adnan Menderes demanded from Great Britain a secret agreement. On 16 December 1956, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lennox Boyd, met with him in Constantinople. Menderes actually dictated to him what he announced on 19 December 1956, when, following the acknowledgement of the Lord Radcliffe's constitutional proposals in the House of Commons, he promised separate self-determination to the Turkish minority of 18%. The statement in short read, when the international and strategic situation permits, and when self-government is working satisfactorily, Her Majesty's government would be ready to review the question of the application of self-determination. When the time comes for this review, that is when these conditions have been fulfilled, it will be the purpose of Her Majesty's government to ensure that any exercise of self-determination will be affected in such a manner that the Turkish Cypriot community, no less than the Greek Cypriot community, shall have freedom to decide for themselves their future status. Partition would be an option. A small parenthesis here. That choice was afforded to the minority of 18% on 24th April 2004, with the two separate referendums over the so-called Annan Plan, a British plan in fact, which the government of the Republic of Cyprus should never have accepted. I strongly recommend everyone to read the damning indictment of the United Nations handling of the Cyprus problem by Oxford constitutionalist Ms. Klearchos, an advisor to the Cypriot president from 1918 to 2004. The book is detailed and scholarly account and is titled An International Relations Debacle 1999-2004. In short, Ms. Pali called the Annan Plan a fiasco designed specifically to legitimize the consequences of the Turkish invasion and occupation of the northern part of Cyprus. So much was the Turkish, end of parenthesis, so much was the Turkish influence on British policy at the end, at that time, that Radolf S. Churchill, son of Sir Winston Churchill, on July 13, 1956, published in The Spectator magazine the monumental article, Our Turkish Foreign Secretary, exposing the extent the Foreign Office was at the mercy of the Turkish government. And Churchill's core criticism was the subservient attitude of the British government over the Turkish rejection of the secret June plan. Instead of devising a proper plan for Cyprus, they bowed to Turkish demands. A second study on partition was sent to London in April 1957. But a month before that, the Turkish government demanded the abolition of the word minority from official documents and replaced by word community. The Foreign Office, capitulating on 15 March 1957, noted, "We can see no objection to such an amendment if it serves to keep the Turks happy." Sir Ivan Kirkpatrick, the first Foreign Office official to ventilate the idea of partition in May 1956, proceeded with even more partition plans, hence his own. This plan is exceptionally memorable. At a time of no computers but hand and mind calculation, it concluded that whichever way Cyprus was partitioned, the result would be 192,000 people uprooted. In 1974, we almost had exactly that number of Greek Cypriot refugees. On March 57, Julian Amery, at the time Under Secretary for War and son-in-law to Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, produced his own partition plan into Greek, Turkish, and British parts. The Turks, having secured the 19th December 1956 partition promise, in early 1957 moved to a federal solution with two zones, one Greek and one Turkish. This Turkish shift was in conformity with the plans devised by constitutionalist Dr. Nihat Erim. With a federal solution, Turkey would be in a much better position to take control of the whole island and not just half of it. Dr. Nihat Erim was involved in the secret negotiations between Britain and Turkey and Lord Radcliffe, and later in 1959 served as a member of the Turkish team of the Constitutional Committee of the Republic of Cyprus to be. The partition plans were sent in 1957 to the State Department for their support, but the Americans found them unacceptable for Cyprus. Determined to secure the American support and satisfy Turkey, the British invented the so-called guaranteed independence. For this, they needed the consent of Archbishop Makarios, obtained in September 1958 by Labour's Barbara Castle on mission to Athens on the recommendation of Governor Sir Hugh Foote, who replaced Sir John Harding. Archbishop Makarios switched from union with Greece to an independent Cyprus, albeit unilaterally and without consulting the people of Cyprus, who were left still fighting for union with Greece. In October 1957, Dr. Fazıl Küçük, the first vice president of Cyprus, published a book titled The Cyprus Question, A Permanent Solution, with a partition map of Cyprus on its front cover, with a line across the 35th parallel, while in London, colonial official Sir John Martin prepared a scheme of his own for enosis. The Foreign Office rejected it, claiming that it would categorically be rejected by the Turks and damage the Anglo-Turkish relations, although it was admitted that enosis was the best solution for Cyprus. On 8 January 1958, the Foreign Office let the Americans know of their promises to the Turks, which they could not abandon, and on the same day also told Dr. Nikaterim that the difficulties of partition were insuperable and steered the Turks towards accepting evolving constitutional devices, because it was not easy to give substance to federal institutions without producing de facto partition. Erim knew Turkey had to follow a pattern policy. So much was the involvement of Dr. Erim in the negotiations between Turkey and the Foreign Office that the British, some years later in their documents, regarded him as the architect of the Zurich and London agreements. In February 1958, a massive demonstration took place in London by Turks and Turkish Cypriots with banners for partition and that Turkey would never allow enosis with Greece. They needed, however, at that point, a tool for Turkey to invade, as and when circumstances permitted. Thus, the Treaty of Guarantee was invented. The provision for a joint or unilateral right for action in the treaty was a demand by Turkish Foreign Minister Fatih Zorlu at the 11th February 1959 meeting at Carlton Gardens in London, following the Zurich agreements. This period between 59 to 63 will be covered by my friend Mr. Lambros Kaulas in his presentation. In October 63, in an effort to modify the unworkable constitution, President Archbishop Makarios drafted a 13-point proposal with the help of the British High Commissioner Sir Arthur Clarke, who had been ordered by London to help, but in such a way that the proposals would affect as little as possible the Turkish interests. It should be noted that Sir Arthur Clarke called the Turkish demand of a federal setup as a schizophrenic and regarded Makarios' initiative as totally logical and justified. However, London thought otherwise, and it may have been the reason he was replaced early 1964 for a year by a Foreign Office official. At the London conference on 16 January 1964, called by the British government and chaired by the Commonwealth Secretary Duncan Sandys, following the Turkish coup against the Republic in December 1963, which, as I said, Lambros will talk about, the president of the Turkish Communal Chamber, Mr. Rauf Denktaş, demanded a voluntary exchange of population, resulting in the concentration of the Turkish population in one area. There would have to be provision for exchange of land between Greek and Turkish people, and for compensation when there was no direct exchange and federal setup. Dr. Nikaterim's instructions came to full swing, as was the secret document discovered by the government of Cyprus in the office of Turkish Cypriot Minister for Agriculture, Fazıl Blumer, when the order was given by the leadership of the Turkish community for all employees of the government to abandon their positions in December 1963, Blumer in his haste forgot the document. It described in detail the Turkish preparation to topple the Republic of Cyprus with the aim of creating two federal states. It was signed by Vice President of Cyprus, Dr. Küçük, and President of the Communal Chamber, Mr. Denktaş, dated 14 September 1963. On 28 February 1964, Turkish Foreign Minister Feridun Semal Erkin told the British government that they would not give up their aim of federation based on geographical separation of the two communities. They had received confidential assurances that the British government sympathized with their aim for federation. The term constituent states, mentioned in some British planning and discussion documents on Cyprus from 75 onwards, it was not until the introduction of the Annan Plan in 2002 that it surfaced in official documents. However, research through the British archives revealed that the Foreign Office had already initiated a paper on the 3rd of January 1964 examining the possibility of dividing Cyprus into a Turkish and a Greek constituent states. The document was titled Plan for the Reconstitution of Cyprus as a Federal State. This map, featured in Greek Cypriot communist Evdoras Ioannidis, Elias Doros in his book titled Cyprus What's Now, published in London in 1964. The writer, who lived in London and retained very good connections with the British political establishment, wrote that partition and federation with two separate states with 38% of the territory of Cyprus given to the Turks was intensely discussed in the Foreign Office for 8 years between 1956 and 1964. In April 1964, the Turkish Cypriots formulated proposals for a federal Republic of Cyprus, whilst the British Planning Department devised a new plan for the future of Cyprus dated 14 February 1964. The plan referred to three long-term solutions, which must involve geographical separation of the Greek and Turkish communities and provided for the use of the American Navy Sixth Fleet and the British Navy to deter Greek naval assault across the Aegean in aid of Cyprus, remember 74, concerted effort with their allies and pro-British elements in Greece to loosen the links between the Greek government and the Greek Cypriots. The three-page document ended with the following paragraph. The various courses of action suggested above would take some time to produce results. In one respect, at least, time is on our side, on the island. Whatever happens, it seems certain that the present redeployment of population will continue and the Turks will gather in the northern part of the island. The more complete this is, the more obvious and acceptable a solution of the kind described in para above will be. On 15th June 1964, the Turkish Communal Chamber set out a claim to a state in North Cyprus bounded by a line from Yala, which is near Paphos, to Famagusta, covering 37% of the total area of Cyprus, identical to Ioannidis' map. That plan materialized 10 years later with the two Turkish invasions. On 12 January 1964, Turkish Prime Minister İsmet İnönü wrote to the British Prime Minister seeking support from the UK, the USA, and other allies to bring about a federation in Cyprus. In his report dated 2nd March 1965, Mr. Gallo Plaza, the United Nations mediator, rejected the Turkish federal demands on economic, social, and moral grounds, which would require compulsory movement of people contrary to Enlightenment principles, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that geographical separation would lead to partition. In November 1966, Major D.S. Hawker of the Cyprus British Forces Base Intelligence Organization published two top-secret reports for UK, US, and Canada eyes only. A comprehensive report, 1st November 1966, titled Notes on the Turkish Cypriot Community and Armed Forces, and another, June 1967, for the Greek Cypriot and Armed Forces.
Good.
In this report, he detailed the armed stockpiles and military structure of the Turkish Cypriots and the activities of the Turkish contingent, and in its last chapter included numerous photographs of Turkish fighters in training. That was happening in Cyprus in 1966. Then there is another map, This map was found in 1967 at the abandoned Turkish village of Strongili in Famagusta district. It was published in Turkish newspaper dedicated to the Turkish Cypriots and the Turkish nation. From February to July 74, the Turkish government repeated calls for a federal constitution of a bi-communal character on a geographical basis where the 18% would never again be called a minority. On 10th July 74, the Cyprus High Commissioner in London, Kostas Achotis, under instructions from the Cyprus government, handed to Alan Goodison of the Foreign Office, a key player in formulating policy over Cyprus, a memorandum titled Inapplicability of Federation. The Cyprus government rejected federalism and the concept of partnership. Now, this map of Cyprus, halved in two parts on a postcard, was circulating in Turkey in 1974, months before the Turkish invasion. And it was found on a captured Turkish soldier in 1974. On 15th July, we had the coup against Archbishop Makarios, and on 20th July, the first Turkish invasion. On 12th August 1974, at the Geneva negotiations, the Turkish Cypriot leader Rauf Denktash gave James Callaghan, the British Foreign Secretary who chaired the negotiations, a proposal for a bi-communal, bi-zonal federation with a map, with 34% of the Republic of Cyprus under the Turks. A few hours later, Turkish Foreign Minister Güneş followed with another proposal for 6 cantons. Both maps gave the Turkish Cypriots 34% of northern part of Cyprus. Now, map 15, this is the map of the Attila line as at 16 August 1974. Now, we have some maps that follow, and are maps that were worked on by the Foreign Office and the British High Commissioner in Cyprus, liaising with the State Department, but always retaining the ownership of the maps, trying alternatives with some territorial adjustments that the Turkish generals would not mind, hoping to lure the Greek Cypriots to agree. I believe these are the maps and the adjustments discussed today in the secret negotiations in Cyprus. This is the so-called Bi-zonal map the government of Cyprus was persuaded by the British and some Greek Cypriot elements to prepare, and which was given by late Tassos Papadopoulos, one of the main drafters, to the Turks on 31st March 1977, during the renewed talks at Vienna, and which the Turks rejected. It offered the Turks 20%, but also left them the occupied Timbu airport. This map, apart from being illegal, as it was drafted and proposed without consulting the people of the Republic, and foremost the refugees, the occupied properties of whom undemocratically tried to bargain with the Turks, it had a major default. It enclaved the entire Carpathia Peninsula Greeks. Their only exodus was through the sea or through a Turkish zone checkpoint by permission. 18. In May 1980, UN Special Representative of the Secretary General, Argentinian Hugo Gobi, arrived in Cyprus, and in 81 proposed this map for a solution of Cyprus. Gobi was not acquainted with the problem of Cyprus, and the British released documents do not make any secret of the fact that he was guided by the British High Commission in Cyprus. Soon after he left his post at the UN, Gobi became an open advocate of partition in speeches and letters to the press. There is a lot to be said about his role, and I have written 2 articles in Daily Simerini in Cyprus on 30th and 31st December 2015 on his responsibilities over the curtailed in favor of Turkey mandate of the Committee for the Missing Persons created during his time. In 2001, the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs awarded Hugo Gobi a Distinguished Service Award. Okay. This is the Gali map, as officially released on 25th August 1999 by the United Nations and during George Vasiliou's presidency, and rejected by the people through demonstrations. Now this map was the forerunner of the Annan Plan and was leaked to Athenian Greek newspaper Ependitis in March 1999, and reported in Daily Simerini in Cyprus on 21st March 1999. It was built on the Kyriakides philosophy and envisaged 3 constitutions, one for each constituent state and a third to govern both. It suggested the return of some 70,000 Greek Cypriot refugees as contemplated in the various territorial adjustments exercises by the Foreign Office between 75 and 77 to lure the Greek Cypriots into accepting it. And lastly is the notorious Annan Plan map, which the UN introduced as from 2002, building it up to Annan 5, and which was rejected by the Greek Cypriots on the 24th of April 2004. It was accepted by the Turkish Cypriots. Another book worth reading and which contributed to the rejection of it is The Case Against the Annan Plan by Professor Van Koufoudakis and Dr. Klearchos Kyriakides, who is one of our speakers today, published in London by Lobby for Cyprus in 2004. And now I will conclude referring to a damning minute submitted to the Cabinet on 30th April 1958 by Foreign Office official J.M. Addis. And he wrote, "I do not believe that any settlement based on a division of the island in any form could now be permanently stable solution. I do not believe that if the island were partitioned along a line acceptable to the Turkish government, the 2 halves of the island could then settle down in harmony. Our general policy in non-self-governing territories is to lead them forward to self-government and to the stage when they can decide their own future. It is quite against our traditions to limit the freedom of choice when the time comes for independence. The communal self-determination to which the December 56 statement subscribes is odious because it denies the possibility of unity in a mixed community. Division is particularly objectionable in an area as small as Cyprus in a Mediterranean context." On 18th January 2016, our Prime Minister, the Right Honourable David Cameron, announced a £20 million budget to fight social isolation for some Muslim women in Great Britain. The passive tolerance of separate communities must end, he said. And writing in the Times, he said issues like gender segregation and discrimination and the isolation of some women in society could help lead to a slide towards radicalization and extremism. And I agree 100% with what he said. But I ask, is this not an act of hypocrisy on the part of the British Foreign Office and Cypriot leadership to insist for 42 years that the Greek Cypriots accept such a segregationist, discriminatory, apartheid, demeaning Bi-communal Bi-zonal Federation based on separating communities and society that will inevitably lead towards radicalization and extremism, especially these days with all the revelations from every corner of the earth of Turkey assisting Daesh, imprisoning journalists, silencing freedom of the press and its citizens, violating human rights, disrespecting the rule of law. Could this be the reason why all countries involved with the Cyprus problem, Great Britain, Greece, Turkey, and the Republic of Cyprus itself, have not to this day ratified the Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, adopted on 30th November 1973 by the United Nations, already ratified by 107 states. And it reads, "In the interest of human dignity, progress, and justice, an end must be put to colonialism and all practices of segregation and discrimination associated therewith, particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertake to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature. Certain acts, which may also be qualified as acts of apartheid, constitute a crime under international law." 57 years on, Mr. Addis' cabinet paper still holds strong. It offers valuable thought to the new inhabitants of the Foreign Office, 10 Downing Street, State Department, and the disorientated, in my mind, United Nations Secretariat that supports and promotes apartheid for Cyprus. It is an open verdict of the unethical, cruel policy followed by the Foreign Office and their subordinates. Cyprus is still suffering as a direct consequence of that odious policy. The Turco-British undemocratic violation of the right to self-determination into a communal self-determination was odious in 1958 and is even more odious today because the despicable and inhumane segregationist BBF, Bi-zonal Bi-communal Federation, is a crime of apartheid, and the people of Cyprus are no children of lesser God to deserve such suppression of their human rights and absence of the rule of law. And to close with the words of Mr. Addis, it is an odious plan because it denies the existence of a unitary state in a mixed community. Division is particularly objectionable in an area as small as Cyprus, in an explosive and unpredictable Mediterranean of our times that runs the ultimate danger of affecting and destabilizing the whole of the rest of Europe, including Great Britain. And my very last words from Greek historian and geographer of the 5th century BC, Herodotus. Free nations ought to fight with all their strength against all those who threaten their freedom and invade their land. Thank you.
So thank you, Mrs. Fanoula Argyrou. Our second talker for tonight, out of three, is Mr. Lambros Kaoulas, who is a PhD candidate in criminology for the University of Edinburgh. His research sheds light on the turbulent period between 1959 and 1964 in Cyprus. And in his presentation, he will talk about the lessons we can learn from that period and the impact it had on other European countries and still has.
Are you from Cyprus? Which part? The north or the south? The Greek or the Turkish one? All of us Cypriot Greeks in this room have been confronted with this dreadful question at some point of our lives. All of us. Every single time we get this tight, uncomfortable, dreadful feeling. Every single time there's a lump in our throat. How to answer this question? How to do it in a way that both addresses the question objectively, but also without being too sentimental and inadvertently offending our uninformed and unaware friend. How to both give an objective answer, but also make sure the ongoing injustice on the island is boldly illuminated. This small event gives some longer and more detailed answers to that very short question, and I would like to thank the Cypriot Student Movement Metovo for the invitation. Too far from my eyes. Fanoula Argyrou has been at the forefront of investigative journalism in regards to the Cyprus problem, at least since the early 1990s. She has been one of the first, if not the first, to bring to the attention of the Cypriot public declassified British documents from the National Archives. She has given enough evidence to prove beyond any doubt that the peace plan that is discussed at this very moment as the solution to the Cyprus problem preceded the problem itself, which begs the question, is the solution the actual problem in the first place? My purpose tonight is to prove to you exactly that, by showing you just how these plans materialized on the ground during the first critical years of the Republic of Cyprus from 1959 to 64 and what preceded them. Turkish scholars have written extensively about the Turkish national security syndrome, a term first used by former Turkish Prime Minister Mesut Yilmaz, who argued that this syndrome has delayed the country's integration in the EU and led to violations of human rights. Aydin writes that Turkey lives with a perennial insecurity complex which carries a sense of confusion on the exact nature of Turkey and its people, and of an uncertain self-identity which is widely reflected in its securitized society and general feeling of insecurity. This insecurity is further exacerbated by the geography of Anatolia, at the crossroads of three continents. The opposition to Enosis at all costs rested on the concern that Greece, united with Cyprus, would encircle Turkey and could potentially threaten her with its navy and air force. Dyer writes that the strategic motive behind Turkey's opposition to Enosis was not limited to sympathy towards Cypriot Turks, but rather the concern that however good Helleno-Turkish relations, the possibility of yet another war with Athens must be numbered among the strategic contingencies they face. These scenarios were purely speculative, but however hypothetical, they play a substantial role in Turkish military thinking and greatly fortify the opposition of Ankara to Enosis, which derives from purely political and emotional grounds. These were the words of Dyer. This point requires particular attention because the proposed partition plans of the island did not rest on a de jure justification or on international law, but rather on political expediency, as Nihat Erim stresses several times in his aforementioned reports, 1956 reports. In fact, even current Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, in his book Strategic Depth, published in 2002, wrote that even if no Muslim existed on the island, Turkey should still maintain a Cypriot question because exactly of its strategic importance. In a recent presentation, I used a five-step pattern to codify Turkish strategy over Cyprus. It is a codification based on all documents that Fanoula has already presented, with Nihat Erim's 1956 reports at the core of it. First, neutralization of Enosis. Second, a precarious independence. 3, partition, federal partition. 4, a demographic override of the Hellenic, of the Greek population. And 5, reconquest, which basically translates as Turkification of the island. By August 1960, step 1, the neutralization of Enosis, was already a reality, as the Cypriot Greek leadership made a compromise with the hope of peace. Moving to step 2, the creation of the unstable Republic of Cyprus, a state fettered by international agreements that gave the right for unilateral intervention to Turkey, Britain and Greece. It was a precarious independence, the constitutional rules of which, according to Stanley Alexander de Smith in his book The New Commonwealth and Constitutions in '64, could have been the product of a nightmarish dialogue between a constitutionalist and a mathematician. Before I proceed, it has to be made clear that the Cypriot Turks did not participate in the colonial struggle, but in fact they were actively against it, siding with the British, something that the colonial power encouraged and welcomed. Considering that, their gains in the new state of affairs were disproportionate. Turkey conceded to independence as it had secured the right of unilateral military intervention, plus disproportionate right for the Cypriot Turkish minority of 18%, which had its status elevated to that of a community. The dividing elements of this constitution were so deeply ingrained that the principle of popular sovereignty had been replaced by the principle of duality, which perfused almost every single provision and article on all executive, legislative, and judicial branches. It effectively divided the state vertically, from the vice president down to the last civil servant. There would have to be a 70-30 ratio for the civil service and a 60-40 ratio for the police and the army. Everything had to be mutually agreed between the two communities. The president and the vice president had increased veto powers. It is for this reason that Turkish scholar Tam Koç described the Republic of Cyprus as a, quote, functionally federated state. But for Turkey, agreements weren't the end, as it sought to eventually manipulate the delicate balances of this constitution in order to prepare the ground for step 3. Step 3 in this codification. Partition in the form of a federation with Turkish intervention if necessary. Melih Hensebel, a Turkish diplomat who accompanied Prime Minister Menderes in signing the Zurich-London agreements and later Director General of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said in an interview, quote, "The most important aspect of this new situation was the right of intervention. To think of the Zurich and London agreements and believe that there would not be an intervention one day would have made the agreements worthless." According to the Oxford Dictionary, proxy war is a war instigated by a major power which does not itself become involved. Turkey had to avoid being seen as directly involved in Cyprus, but maintain the image of the benevolent guardian of the Cypriot Turks. So it had to indirectly interfere with TMT, the Turkish resistance organization, as its proxy, to create the necessary destabilizing conditions that would precipitate the Turkish military invasion. To do that, it employed provocations, assassinations, fomentation of intercommunal strife, and large-scale demographic engineering. TMT was a paramilitary formation initially founded in 1957 by Rauf Denktaş, a Cypriot Turk crown prosecutor who worked for the British until 1958. From 1957 to 1958, TMT, mostly in Cypriot Turkish hands at the time, with some contact with Turkey, unified under its banner several other Cypriot-Turkish political and paramilitary organizations operating since 1955, not against Britain, but against EOGA. TMT called for its members to join the British colonial police as auxiliaries and the reserve force. Many served as brutal torturers of Cypriot Greek political prisoners, and they exploited their privileged positions to further TMT's goals. For example, Mehmet Ali Tremesheli, a high-level TMT militant, was also an auxiliary of the colonial police. He was able to distribute weapons at a time the British had imposed emergency laws that provided for the death penalty for anyone caught carrying arms. Many teenage Cypriot Greeks were hanged. Cypriot Greeks, they were hanged under this law. By the end of 1958, more than 3,000 Turks worked for the British police, colonial police, many deliberately recruited without qualifications. British colonial authorities were happy to use TMT because attention was partially deflected from them, and it was another lever to derail the Enosis struggle. But many British officials acknowledged in their internal reports that the situation was getting far beyond their control, as they were playing with fire, and that's exactly what happened. In January 1958, when British proposed self-government, TMT would briefly attack the British forces and instigate violent demonstrations against the British forces in favor of Taksim for being too friendly towards the Greeks despite their previous cooperation. In 1958, and after the resumption of diplomatic negotiations to solve the problem, TMT came fully under the control of the Turkish army. It was decided during a meeting in Ankara by Turkish Foreign Minister Fatih Zorlu and the Cypriot-Turkish leaders Fazil Küçük and Rauf Denktaş. They were the political leadership of TMT, and these two would be the vice president of the Republic of Cyprus and the president of the Turkish Communal Chamber later. Lieutenant General Danis Karabeler, who was the head of the Mobilization Supervision Committee, later known as the Special Warfare Bureau, was assigned with investigating this matter. This secret and special unit was part of the Stay Behind network, which was established in 1952 after Turkey's entrance into NATO. The Turkish army devised the plan for the reconquest of Cyprus. Major Ismail Tansu re-established TMT, now fully under the control of the Turkish army. The plan provided that if the existence of TMT becomes known, Turkey will deny any relationship and claim that it was the exclusive creation of the Cypriot Turks. The headquarters were in Ankara, with training and supply centers in mainland Turkey. Arms, ammunition, money, and serving army officers with fake passports and identity were clandestinely shipped to Cyprus in numerous secret trips back and forth. In October 1959, Denise, one such arms smuggling boat, was intercepted by a British minesweeper, and the story reached the media. It was during the transitional period, and the Zurich-London agreements had already been signed. The Cypriot Greeks were shocked, and the incident almost wrecked the process, but Makarios remained on the negotiating table. The first commander of the reborn TMT in Nicosia was Lieutenant Colonel of the Turkish Army Ali Riza Vurushkan, codenamed Bozkurt, Grey Wolf, who arrived in Cyprus as a bank inspector along with other officers. Between 1958 and 1960, the time of negotiation, while the negotiations were taking place and the revolutionary activities of EOGA were ending, TMT was already organized with branches in all districts and weapons and ammunition in place hidden in underground. The target was to train 5,000 mujahid by the end of 1959 and 10,000 by the end of 1960. TMT's aim was to safeguard the Cypriot Turks and enforce Turkish policy on Cyprus. In case of extensive EOGA operations for Enosis, it would prepare the ground for a Turkish invasion and occupation of the whole island if it needs be. Now please pay attention to this detail. The Turkish army created a large, heavily armed paramilitary formation in case there are EOGA operations. But as we will see, TMT's provocations after independence would fatefully cause a Cypriot Greek backlash. Article 6 of the September 1963 Plumer document reads, quote, "There can be no doubt that this move by the Turkish community will cause a reaction and counter-moves of the Greek Cypriots, and the Greeks may undertake a de facto raid on the Turks. As a result of such aggressive moves by the Greeks, a struggle will begin between the two communities, and this struggle will judge the final outcome." As you can see, a self-fulfilling prophecy was in place. A Cypriot Greek reaction to the provocation was inescapable. By August 58, TMT called for a complete ceasefire with EOGA to avoid being visible and ceased all public appearances. By February 59, when the agreements were signed, it became invisible from the public eye and seemingly dormant. Until 1963, Turkey continued to train Cypriot Turks and to channel arms through secluded anchorages in the north. TMT also established an underground network in the new police force responsible for intelligence gathering and arms production and storage. The Cypriot Greeks were receiving some intelligence about these moves and were aware that the Cypriot Turkish political leadership, which was also TMT's leadership, was preparing for something, and by 1962 they started organizing a rudimentary network of their own paramilitary formations called Omades, led by former members of EOKA, and as a contingency plan in case TMT engages in an offensive. The intricacies of the Kyriakides constitution were exploited to the maximum. Miltiadis Christodoulou, founder of the Cyprus News Agency and first government spokesman, writes, quote, "From the very first months after the creation of the Republic, the inability to make progress in various areas in accordance with the provisions of the agreements became evident. Constant friction and conflict were being repeated with mutual recriminations and accusations about the stance shown by each side. Almost the whole of 1961, which was the first year of the Republic's existence, passed amid tension. Cypriot Turkish MPs blackmailed for the speedy implementation of the ratios. In March 61, budgets were voted down and the state remained without official revenue streams. In October 61, Vice President Kuchuk used the veto power to halt the creation of a unified Cyprus army, as the Cypriot Turks demanded ethnically segregated units within the force. And there was constant friction over the municipalities as well, as the Turkish leadership insisted on separate geographical areas and institutions in each city. Denktash warned in August and September 1962 all Cypriot Turks who wanted unified municipalities with consequences. The constitution was as unworkable as predicted. Denktash threatened in April 63, quote, "Makarios should know that if he takes action in this direction, that is of amending the constitution, he will find himself facing thousands more graves." After consecutive standstills, in November 1963, Makarios did propose 13 points for amendment. After first consulting the British High Commissioner to smooth out the problematic parameters of the constitution. Before the Cypriot Turkish leadership even replied, Turkey, through its ambassador, rejected them in a threatening tone. On the 21st of December 1963, clashes, as anticipated, began after a police patrol with Cypriot Greek policemen stopped a Turkish Cypriot car suspected of carrying TMT weapons for inspection. In a few moments' time, a large group of Cypriot Turks arrived who abused the policemen, who had to fire back in defense, killing 2 Cypriot Turks. That kindled the long-awaited fire. Conflict erupted all over the island, and all Cypriot Turks, with the exception of very few who would later be forced to do so as well, abandoned their offices from the government and the civil service. On the 29th of December 1963, in a press conference, Denktash and Kuchuk proclaimed the Republic of Cyprus dead. A permanent theme in Turkish narratives on the Cyprus problem is that Cypriot Greeks and Cypriot Turks were unable to live with each other, despite doing so for centuries. The status of being a minority amongst the Greek majority was presented of being a lethal condition by definition. But this was part of the propaganda campaign. Let's say the psychological win of the proxy warfare serving these strategic ends. One widely used method was state-orchestrated provocations and false flag operations with the dual purpose of radicalizing extremists and galvanizing Turkish opinion. Greeks and Turks of Cyprus lived generally in peace during colonial times. EOKA aimed to unite Cyprus with Greece. While the Turks were overlooked and ignored, sometimes, there weren't any hostile plans against them. It was assumed they would be a safeguarded minority in the Greek state, in the same way Armenians, Maronites, and Latins would be. Georgios Grivas, the commander of EOKA, as early as July 1955, and before any serious conflict between Greeks and Turks arose, he ordered the circulation of proclamations in the Turkish language, reassuring Cypriot Turks that their lives, property, and dignity wouldn't be harmed as they were considered, quote, genuine friends and allies. In August 1955, Kuchuk and Menderes circulated a spurious story that AGEL, the Communist Party of Cyprus, and the only party with a strong base of Cypriot Turkish supporters, was supposedly planning an imminent massacre of Turks. A British investigation found no shred of evidence. The ludicrous accusation, along with a provocative bomb in Thessaloniki, provided the necessary fuel of hatred and generated the anti-Hellenic pogroms in September 1955 in Constantinople, which also hit the Armenian and the Jewish communities particularly hard. The bomb was placed by an agent provocateur of the Turkish Secret Services, who later became the governor of Nevşehir. Another bomb went off at the press office of the Turkish consulate in Nicosia, this time in June 1958. According to Nancy Kroso, it, quote, served as the time signal and an excuse for Turkish rioters to invade the Greek sector of the old town. These were the first serious conflicts between Greeks and Turks on the island, and their legacy haunts us to this day. The leader of TMT in Dektash admitted in interviews later that the bomb was placed by Turkish teddy boys. These incidents, accompanied by sustained propaganda campaign, cultivated and nurtured the hate against Cypriot Greeks. Throughout its terror campaign on the island itself, which included the slaughter and beheading of the innocent Cypriot Greeks, Greek villagers of Kondemenos in June 1958, TMT maintained that its actions were aimed to avert the massacre of Turkish Cypriots. After the establishment of the Republic on the 25th of March 1962, two other bombs tore apart the Bayraktar and Omeria mosques in Nicosia. The symbolism was strong. It took place on the anniversary of the Hellenic Revolution against the Ottoman Empire of 1821, and at the Bayraktar Mosque, where the body of the Ottoman flag bearer who fell at the conquest of Nicosia in 1570 was buried. General of the Turkish Army, Sabri Yirmebeshoglu, once the commander of the Special Warfare Bureau of the Turkish Army, inadvertently confessed in 2010 in an interview that the blasts were a result of a provocation, justifying by saying that in special war, certain acts of sabotage are staged and blamed on the enemy to increase public resistance. In order to trigger the much-needed Greek reaction, there were unprovoked attacks against soft targets as well. In October 1960, the Cypriot Turkish Health Minister ordered the removal of the Red Cross symbol from the General Hospital because it was not equally represented from the Red Crescent. In 1961 and 62, a wave of soft target attacks by TMT against random Cypriot Greeks took place, such as the shooting of policemen, the shooting of a couple, and the robbing and raping of another couple by 4 armed Turks. Throughout 1964, random pedestrians, drivers, farmers, monks, and civil servants were shot by undisclosed TMT gunmen, usually when they happened to be in the vicinity of Turkish enclaves. TMT meticulously cultivated the partitionist mentality. Financial transactions, friendly relations, and dealings of any sort with the Cypriot Greeks were forbidden, and a campaign known as From Turk to Turk was imposed. Cypriot Turks who disobeyed the order and continued to trade with Cypriot Greeks were threatened, beaten, imprisoned, and sometimes killed. Kuchuk warned in December 55, quote, "Anyone who does not obey this order will be considered a traitor to his country, and we shall not be responsible for the catastrophe that will befall him from the acts of vengeance that we carry out. We are certain that with God's help and the succor of the great Turkish nation, we shall achieve our aim very soon." The Cypriot Turkish journalist Kyriakides received a letter by Dektash in March 60. "We were shocked to discover that you frequent Greek Cypriot places of entertainment. This is our first and last warning. If you were not lucky enough to be an intellectual, there was no need to give you a warning. You would suddenly see 3 or 4 men outside your house and they would beat you up. Cypriot Turks who were speaking English or Greek were forced to pay a fine of 1 or 2 shillings or be beaten for every foreign word spoken, at a time when some of them couldn't even speak Turkish. Many public figures who disagreed with the From Turk to Turk campaign were murdered. As for the kind of inflammatory language used in the press, I will only give 2 telling examples from the newspaper published by the Vice President himself, Halkin Sesi. One in January 62. Quote, "The Greeks cannot approach us and bite us because their teeth are no longer sharp. Apart from this, we are in a position to smash the faces of anyone trying to bite us." Another one, exactly a year later, warned, "Have you Greeks heard the voice of Ankara? If you think so, come." There were innumerable such. History shows that whether Greeks wanted to really massacre Cypriot Turks, history shows whether Greek Cypriots wanted to really massacre Cypriot Turks. From 1964 until 1974, when the Turkish military invasion did eventually take place, the Greeks had the military superiority on the island, the political freedom, and plenty of opportunities to do so, but they refused. TMT ruled the Cypriot Turks with an iron fist. In 1958, a wave of murders took place of opposition figures. From 1960 to 64, Cypriot Turkish politicians and journalists who wanted to pursue an autonomous trajectory were either strongly advised to step down or were threatened. In April 62, 2 investigative journalists, Ayhan Hikmet and Ahmed Muzaffer Yurkan, published information in the newspaper Cumhuriyet about the Bayraktar and Omeria bombings. The latter concluded that those responsible for the bombings of the 2 mosques were Cypriot Turkish criminals with the purpose of reigniting intercommunal conflict, pointing the finger at Dektash. The journalists eschewed TMT's methods and plans for partition and supported peaceful coexistence. Dektash accused them of being agents of the Cypriot government. Masked TMT members then broke into their houses at night and murdered them, averting the publication of the perpetrators' names. When the ambassador of Turkey attended the funeral, he was recalled to Ankara immediately. Derviş Ali Gavazoglu was another Turkish Cypriot Turk who rejected TMT's policies. He was a trade unionist and a member of AGEL and perceived himself as a Cypriot Turkish patriot. He accused Klearchos of unpatriotic and that he uprooted 20,000 Cypriot Turks to herd them together in places that are no different from concentration camps. He considered Federation as the plan of a quote handful of Turkish Cypriot fascists to divide the Cypriot people. He was also gunned in April '65 along with his Greek comrade Kostas Michaoulis. The Cypriot Turkish leadership initially blamed the Cypriot Greeks, but later hailed the murders as a success. Weiner and Teitelbaum considered 5 forms of demographic engineering which are likely to have significant effects on the security of states and peoples. Addition, subtraction, substitution, outmigration, restriction of entry. By the end of 1964, Turkey used all of them in order to unmix the Cypriot population, to concentrate Cypriot Turks in one area and to restrict entry in those areas to government authorities and the Cypriot Greeks in general. The movement of Cypriot Turks started from 1958. In the September 63 Plumer document, an inflow of Turkish citizens was programmed after the Turkish intervention, with some posing as tourists. After the December 63 incidents, the project of gathering the Cypriot Turks in one area was already in full swing. By the end of March 64, around 10,000 Cypriot Turks were moved to TMT-controlled enclaves, very often at gunpoint and against their will. A general committee was created as the governing body of the Cypriot Turks, which had full control over their lives. Cypriot Turks were not allowed to leave the enclaves without permission or meet Greeks, and were punished with fines of imprisonment if they did so. A £25 fine, imprisonment, or lashing would be imposed to anyone visiting Greek areas for, quote, walking, visiting Greek Cypriots, or entertaining. Another proof to show that Turkey's plan over Cyprus was not based on a supposed defense from Cypriot Greeks comes from an unlikely event. The first neighborhood to be attacked in December 63 was the Armenian quarters of Nicosia and Famagusta, known as Armeno-Mahallas. This episode, in my opinion, is the strongest piece of evidence to prove that Turkish actions in the 1960s had nothing to do with protecting the Cypriot Turks and everything to do with cold strategic calculations. In the first days of the offensive, TMT attacked the area, forcing the Armenians out and taking over their homes, businesses and churches. 231 Armenian families were forced to become refugees, many emigrating to Soviet Armenia, Britain, North America and Australia. The irony is that while a large number of Cypriot Armenians have been on the islands for almost 1,000 years, a sizable proportion of the community came in Cyprus in the first place to find refuge during the Armenian genocide. A monument commemorating this genocide in Armeno-Mahallas, erected in 1932, the second in the world to be erected, was destroyed to be replaced with a monument to Kemal Atatürk. The Church of Virgin Mary was turned into a military camp. Very few Armenians remained in the quarters until the 3rd of March, a day before the arrival of the UN peacekeeping force. TMT gave them 3 hours to leave. Why are these details important? Because the Cypriot Armenians were in no way part of the Cypriot Greek defense mechanisms. Not they participated in the Cypriot Greek paramilitary armadas that were created to deal with the offensive. It goes without saying that they were not agitating for Enosis in any way. Why then were the Cypriot Armenians attacked? From December 64 until the end of December 63 until the end of 64, battles ensued. The Cypriot Greeks responded to the offensive with a paramilitary network of their own and a hastily built chaotic security structure to defend themselves and the Republic of Cyprus. In terms of propaganda, it was a lose-lose situation for the Cypriot Greeks, at least for the moment. All the facts we now know weren't available at the time. If the Cypriot Greeks didn't respond, while they saw that TMT was growing, they would be overpowered. When they would respond, Turkey was ready to accuse them of violating the rights of the Cypriot Turks, but there was no choice than to respond. In August 64, Turkey finally directly intervened for the first time in order to protect TMT's leadership, which found itself isolated in a small area after a Cypriot government counteroffensive. Turkish fighter jets bombed the Greek villages of Tillyria with napalm bombs, literally charcoaling their victims. Turkey threatened to invade, only to be halted by international diplomacy who didn't want a rupture in NATO's southeastern flank. Turkey has for 60 years been allowed to behave in this way with impunity and with the tolerance of the West, who tries to square the circle in Cyprus politically, legally and morally to justify the unjustifiable, all for the sake of prioritizing concerns. the fight against communism during the Cold War and the fight against terrorism today, make the West cater to outlandish Turkish demands and to turn a blind eye to the large-scale crimes of the Turkish state. The recent developments in both the western and the eastern borders of Turkey show many things. Turkey is at the epicenter of the Syrian crisis, using both proxy warfare in the form of ISIS and the Turkmen paramilitaries to curb any possibility for any sort of limited, even Kurdish self-determination. On the other hand, demographic engineering of some sort in the form of the tormented refugees to extract the maximum gains possible, disregarding the blood sacrifices that entails, even for innocent Turkish citizens who are torn apart by terrorist bombs exploding one after the other. What has been played out as a miniature in Cyprus is now, in a way, and I hope I'm not exaggerating, magnified. If Turkey was able to violate so many rules, agreements, and codes of conduct in Cyprus and get away with it, why stop doing it now? Now the whole world can understand what small Cyprus has been going through. Just read the recently leaked documents where Erdogan blackmails EU leaders with harsh language over immigration, threatening to send refugees and threatening to have children drowned and washed up onto the beach. If the Cyprus problem is solved in this way today, which will create a volatile new state with a dangerously weak security structure, the challenges from the West will be enormous. An artificial state of affairs created in the aforementioned conditions will be legalized and normalized. This will create a dangerous precedent. Turkey wants to maintain intervention rights. What will be the survival chances of this state? Is the West, and especially the European Union, ready to concede to something like that? Thank you.
Our third and final speaker for the evening is Dr. Klearchos, Kyriakides, Assistant Professor in Law at the University of Lancashire. He is speaking his professional capacity and not those of any organization with which he has or had any relationship. He declares an interest as both of his late grandfathers were born in villages which were ethnically cleansed and occupied by Turkey in 1974. He will further elaborate on the issue and discuss the potential of a sustainable solution based on the framework of the current negotiations. Unfortunately, due to the load of his schedule, he couldn't be with us tonight. However, we have his presentation on video and he will answer any questions from the audience at the end through Skype. Thank you.
Hello everybody. This is a short talk which will hopefully try to achieve three objectives. The first is to draw your attention to the foundations of what may be described as the grand strategy of Turkey in relation to the island of Cyprus. The second is the nature of what may be described as a Turkish doctrine of division, which has been stamped upon the Republic of Cyprus since the establishment of the Republic in 1960. And the third is to highlight the extraordinary dangers which flow from this doctrine of division, not only for the Republic of Cyprus, but for the remainder of the European Union and the wider democratic world. If there is a theme that runs through this short talk and links my three objectives, it's quite simply the one that was articulated back in 1863 by Benjamin Disraeli, who was at the time an up-and-coming Conservative politician. He eventually, of course, became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time of the British acquisition of Cyprus in 1878. But back in 1863, in the context of the United States, Benjamin Disraeli said something rather profound. A colony does not cease to be a colony just because it becomes independent, or indeed is independent. I'm summarising what Benjamin Disraeli said, but there is a great deal of wisdom embodied in that saying. The Republic of Cyprus was established as an ostensibly sovereign state back in 1960, but in my view, it did not cease to be a colony. in a sense, it remained a colony of both Turkey and the United Kingdom, and I'll try and explain why in a moment or two. Let me now move on to the first of my three main objectives, which is to articulate the foundations of Turkish grand strategy in relation to the island of Cyprus. Now, I'm using the phrase island of Cyprus because the Republic of Cyprus was established in 1960. And even when it was established in 1960, it was not granted sovereignty over the whole of the island because the British kept two sovereign base areas. Let's have a look at the foundations of Turkish grand strategy. In a way, they can be deciphered if one considers the analysis of the Turkish approach to the Republic of the island of Cyprus at the London conference of late August and early September 1955. The then representative of Turkey to the conference, Fatih Zorlu, issued a number of fascinating remarks which give us a clear insight into the nature of what I call Turkish grand strategy. This is what he said. The importance of Cyprus for Turkey does not arise from a single cause. It is a necessity which emanates from the exigencies of history, geography, economy, and military strategy, the right to existence and security. Mr. Zorlu, who later became Foreign Minister of Turkey, added the following: by its geographical structure, the island of Cyprus is a prolongation of the Anatolian Peninsula, of which the soil is Anatolian and of which the climate is Anatolian. So straight away, the conclusion one draws from that is that in the mindset of Mr. Zorlu back in 1955, and indeed in the mindset of many other Turkish politicians and generals since then, the island of Cyprus is not an independent actor, it's not an independent island, it's not separate from Turkey, it's part and parcel of Turkey. I want to read to you a little bit more from what Mr. Zorlu said back in 1955. He suggested that since the Ottoman conquest of the island in 1571, at which point the island of Cyprus became part of the Ottoman Empire and Caliphate, the island has been attached to the motherland, that is to say Turkey, as any other province of Turkey. The island has thereby constituted an inseparable part thereof. Mr. Zorlu added that this alleged territorial connection is matched by an alleged demographic connection. In all the course of history, the fate of Cyprus has remained attached to that of the peoples settled in the Anatolian Peninsula, and that has, in return, affected the fate of the peoples living in Anatolia. All in all, therefore, Mr. Zorlu summarised the position in this way. This island constitutes an integral part of the Turkish mainland from the point of view of geopolitics and physical geography. Now, you might be saying, well, why is this academic going on about something that was said by a Turkish minister back in 1955? Well, the answer's straightforward. What the minister said in 1955 is as relevant today as it was back then. And everything that you see in the context of Turkey's actions in relation to Cyprus can be understood with reference to those remarks about Cyprus being an extension of and an integral part of and an inseparable part of Turkey. Let me just give you two or three examples which illustrate this point. A new pipeline has apparently been built connecting Turkey to the Turkish, what is now the Turkish occupied part of northern Cyprus. That is bringing water from, or is going to bring water from Anatolia to the occupied part of Cyprus. That infrastructure project cannot be properly understood without what I've just read to you in relation to Mr. Zorlu. A second example is to do with what is going on at present, where there's all this discussion about what will happen to this natural gas that may be extracted from the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus. Will it be sent to Europe via Greece, or by sea, or via Turkey? Turkey is pushing for that natural gas to go via Turkey. Why? I would suggest there is a connection with what Mr. Zorlu said back in 1955. So that really is an insight into one of the foundations of Turkish grand strategy. But there is another foundation to Turkish grand strategy. It flows from the report submitted in 1956 by Professor Nihat Erim to the then Prime Minister of Turkey, Adnan Menderes. I haven't got time to go into the details of what Professor Erim submitted to Prime Minister Menderes, but the gist of what he said was very helpfully summarised by the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, in 1958. So let me read to you what Harold Macmillan said, and I'm reading here from the transcript of Parliament in Westminster on the 26th of June 1958. The Turks, I am putting their view, Mr. Macmillan said, regard Cyprus as an extension of the Anatolian plain, a kind of offshore island with vital significance for their defence and their security. They say, this has been their argument up to now, that the Turkish Cypriot community must not be ruled by a Greek Cypriot community. And they, that is to say the Turks, have advocated the physical separation of the two communities by means of a territorial partition. That is their view of the situation. Now, as events were to unfold, Turkey did not manage to partition the island of Cyprus in the late 1950s, but what Turkey did manage to achieve was the constitutional and the demographic partition of the population of Cyprus by means of this, what became known as the Zurich and London Agreements of 1959 and the constitutional and other legal instruments introduced in 1960 upon the establishment of the Republic. What are the pillars of this strategy and this related doctrine of division? Quite simply, they boil down, there are several different pillars, but they boil down to this, that the population of the island of Cyprus is divided into two communities. Greek Cypriots, who are Greek Orthodox Christians, and Turkish Cypriots, who are Muslims. And this is of critical importance in terms of understanding what is going on today in the secret leader-led process in Nicosia. It is a continuation of this doctrine of division, in which the citizens of an island, which is also a sovereign state, are constitutionally carved up into two. They are not integrated into one block of citizens, as one would normally find in a liberal democracy. The citizens are constitutionally separated into two separate communities. And the phrase communities is somewhat misleading. Why is it misleading? Because if you have a look at the definition of what the two communities mean, one sees that there is a profound religious as well as ethnic strand to the definition. So if one looks at the constitution set out in the Constitution of 1960, that is to say the Constitution of the Republic of Cyprus, one sees the first of these pillars of the doctrine of division neatly set out. So Article 2.1 of the Constitution of the Republic of Cyprus says that the Greek community, interesting, not the Greek Cypriot community, but the Greek community. The Greek community comprises all citizens of the Republic who are of Greek origin and whose mother tongue is Greek, or who share the Greek cultural traditions, or who are members of the Greek Orthodox Church. So, what occurred in 1960 was that 80% or so of the population was constitutionally herded into this community called the Greek community that was stamped with Greek ethnicity and stamped with the Greek Orthodox Church. What about the then minority of 18%? The Turks of Cyprus. Well, they were constitutionally herded into a separate community known as the Turkish community. And under Article 2, subparagraph 2 of the Constitution of the Republic of Cyprus of 1960, the Turkish community comprises all citizens of the Republic who are of Turkish origin and whose mother tongue is Turkish, or who share the Turkish cultural traditions, or who are Muslims, spelled M-O-S-L-E-M-S. So, anybody who is of Turkish ethnicity or of the Islamic faith was constitutionally coerced into a separate community. So you had two distinct and separate ethno-religious communities upon the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus. This was not, and I repeat this, was not established as a liberal democracy under the principle of equality, under the principle of non-discrimination, under the principle of majoritarian democracy, certainly not that. And instead, what was established in 1960 was what I call a quasi-Ottoman state, which harked back to the Ottoman imperial era, when the subjects of the Sultan who inhabited the island of Cyprus were carved up into Muslims and non-Muslims under the old millet system, which was a doctrine of administrative division. This is very important in terms of understanding what is happening today in the so-called leader-led process in Nicosia, because the two leaders of the two communities are meeting in secret in a quasi-Ottoman secretive settlement process, which is actually a surrender process, to try and cook up a constitutional and legal settlement to determine the fate of the members of the two communities, the Greek community, which is now called the Greek Cypriot community, and the Turkish community, which is now called the Turkish Cypriot community. So this is very important for people to understand. History is the key to understanding the present. What you have in Nicosia today is not a democratization process in which an attempt is made to modernize the 1960 constitution and bring it up to date and to dismantle these pillars of division which have contaminated the island of Cyprus up to 1960 and the Republic of Cyprus since 1960. What is going on in Nicosia today is an attempt to breathe fresh life into these pillars of this pillar of division going back to the Ottoman Empire and the 1960 Constitution. I would suggest this is extremely dangerous for the European Union and for the wider democratic world. Does the democratic world really want to enshrine in the constitutional law of a European Union member state the separation of Christians from Muslims? Is this in the interests of France and Germany and Belgium and the United Kingdom and all the other countries which have growing Muslim populations? Do we really want to establish in the European Union the concept that Christians should be concentrated into one community with Muslims constituted into a separate community? Is that something that is consistent with democracy? Is that consistent with liberal principles? Is that consistent with the rule of law? Is that consistent with the prohibition against discrimination? Because what happens to non-Greeks and non-Turks, or to put it another way, what happens to non-Greek Orthodox Christians and non-Muslims? Well, under the Constitution in 1960 of the Republic of Cyprus, and under this concept of bi-communalism, you have a choice. You can either, if you want to be a citizen of the Republic of Cyprus, you must either be a Greek, and thus a member of the Greek community, or a Turk, and thus a member of the Turkish community. So if you're a Maronite, an Armenian, a Latin, or, for that matter, a Roma, you, or anybody else for that matter, who is neither Greek nor Turkish, you have to be coerced constitutionally into one of these two communities. I suggest that's dehumanizing. I suggest that's an affront to the dignity of anybody who is neither Greek nor Turkish. It's also an affront to anybody who is neither Christian nor Muslim. Why should, in the 21st century, somebody who is a lawful resident of Cyprus, who becomes a citizen of the Republic of Cyprus, but happens to be of Hindu religion or of Filipino nationality or origin, or of Dutch origin for that matter, or of Italian origin, or of Uzbek origin, or whichever country you want to take around the world, why should a citizen of the Republic of Cyprus of a different ethnic or religious background be constitutionally coerced into one of the two communities? For me, this whole concept of bi-communalism is dehumanizing and an affront to the dignity of people. There's more to it than that, but I'm really conscious of the time, so let me just now move on to the second pillar of Turkish grand strategy and the related doctrine of division. And this is the one that Prime Minister Macmillan noted back in 1958. I'll just read to you that sentence again. They say, that is to say the Turks say, that the Turkish community must not be ruled by a Greek Cypriot community, and, this is the key point, they have advocated the physical separation of the two communities by means of a territorial partition. Now, back then, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots and others were scattered around the island of Cyprus. There were no Greek Cypriots concentrated in one particular geographical region and Turkish Cypriots constituted in another geographical region. People were scattered around the place, intermingled with one another. And that was in a way, that's as it should be. That's as it should be. But Turkish grand strategy from the 1956 onwards, with the theories of Nihat Erin very much in mind, the strategy and the doctrine of Turkey was pushing for the Greeks, the Greek community, to be herded into and concentrated into a zone in the south of the island of Cyprus, and the Turkish Cypriots and Muslims scattered around the island to be constitutionally and physically herded into the zone in the north of the island of Cyprus. This is important for understanding what happened after the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960. There was as you know, a constitutional breakdown between the two communities in 1963-64. There was intercommunal clashes and fighting and bloodshed and murders and other unlawful killings committed to the detriment of the members of the two communities. People were killed because they happened to be Greek or because they happened to be Turkish. And as a result of that, we ended up seeing in Cyprus self-segregation. Turkish Cypriots, under the leadership of the Turkish community, ended up self-segregating in these pockets of territory called enclaves. And eventually, with the Turkish invasion and the occupation and the ethnic cleansing that occurred in 1974, these pockets of self-segregated Turkish Cypriot enclaves ended up being consolidated in this zone, Turkish-occupied and ethnically cleansed zone in the north of the island of Cyprus, and Greek Cypriots and others who were ethnically cleansed from the north ended up settling in what became the unoccupied part of the Republic of Cyprus in the south of the island, south with a small s, not a capital S. So after 1974, you had the creation of these two de facto zones. The Turkish occupied zone in the north, where Turkish Cypriots ended up living, and the unoccupied zone in what was the unoccupied part of the Republic of Cyprus, where Greek Cypriots were living. So what Turkey achieved in 1974 was the implementation of the Nihat Erin strategy of 1956 as summarised by Harold Macmillan in 1958. So you had the creation of, by force and contrary to law, of two zones, a de facto Turkish zone and a de facto Greek zone in the south. So if you can think about the emblem of division, the mathematical symbol of division, that is precisely what Turkey managed to achieve in 1974. I won't even go into the details, but what I've tried to sketch out to you are two pillars of this doctrine of division which Turkey has been pushing for more than 5 decades, in fact 6 decades if you go back to 1955 and more especially 1956. So the first pillar is the concept of two communities, the Greek community and the Turkish community, and the second pillar is the creation of two zones with all of the Turks concentrated in the north and all of the Greeks concentrated in the south. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the key to understanding what is going on in Nicosia in the so-called leader-led process, because what they're trying to do is to lend a facade of legitimacy upon unlawful ethnic cleansing, upon an unlawful ethno-religious restructuring of the Republic of Cyprus, and upon the consequences of an unlawful invasion. That, for me, is not only an affront to the rule of law, it's not only an affront to the founding values of the United Nations and the European Union, even though I'm a Eurosceptic. It's also something that's it's also unethical, isn't it? I don't think it's morally acceptable to, if you believe in liberal democracy as I do, I don't think it's morally acceptable for a constitution to separate Christians from Muslims. And I don't think it's morally acceptable for Christians to be given their own zone and for Muslims to be given their own zone. For me, this is completely and utterly repugnant morally. They may be able to cook up rustle up a deal and enshrine the two pillars of division in a sheet of paper that they'll call a settlement plan. But in my view, that document would be a symbol of division. It would be an instrument of surrender, and it would be contrary to the enlightened principles of liberal democracy. What are those enlightened principles of liberal democracy? Everybody is an individual whose dignity must be respected. The principle of equality demands that every single individual is treated equally under the law. That the diversity of the members of a society is respected and indeed cherished. The problem with what they're trying to rustle up in Nicosia is that they want to enshrine bi-communalism and enshrine bi-zonality. And as a consequence, they want to give supremacy to Greeks in the south, Turks in the north. Well, where does that leave non-Greeks and non-Turks? Where does that leave non-Christians and non-Muslims? Well, it leaves them in an institutionally racist and institutionally discriminatory vacuum. And you see this institutional racism, institutional discrimination, and indeed unwitting racism and unwitting discrimination everywhere you look. For example, if you read the so-called joint declaration issued by the two leaders on the 11th of February 2014, you see multiple references to Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. In fact, there's a sentence that says that the proposed settlement will primarily, and I can't find the precise wording, but they say the proposed settlement will first and foremost benefit Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. There's an overwhelming emphasis on Christians and Muslims. President Anastasiadis has said that the proposed settlement will result in Cyprus being a model of coexistence between Christians and Muslims. The Prime Minister of Turkey has said something similar. He said, yes, we must have a settlement under which there is coexistence between Muslims and Christians. In a liberal democracy, it's not only Christians and Muslims who form part of society, everybody forms part of society, including atheists for that matter. So why is there this exclusive preoccupation with Christians and Muslims? How is this exclusive preoccupation with Muslims and Christians affecting anybody who is a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Jew or indeed an atheist or somebody who adheres to another faith? How do they feel? Is their dignity being affronted, as I suggest it is? And if so, why is there this fixation with Christians and Muslims? In the paper I've written that will be published shortly here in Britain, I issue countless examples where this bi-communal culture has resulted in the use of institutionally racist and otherwise institutionally discriminatory terminology. But why does it exist? It exists because the Republic of Cyprus is a quasi-Ottoman entity, and what they're cooking up in Nicosia and Cyprus is a quasi-Ottoman structure, which will consist of a Greek Cypriot state, a Turkish Cypriot state, and a federal state. And I call this the 1-2-3 strategy at Turkey, because this is what Turkey has been pushing for 5 decades. Turkey wants, and it is quite clear if you read the declassified British, American and United Nations documents, it's quite clear that what Turkey has wanted is not clear-cut. This is in the last 50 years. Turkey has not wanted a clear-cut partition between Greece taking the south and Turkey taking the north. What Turkey wants is a bi-communal, bi-zonal federation, so that the two communities are constitutionally enshrined in a constitutional instrument, and that the two zones are constitutionally enshrined in a constitutional instrument, and that a federal government will overhang these two communities and two zones, and indeed two states. So why is it the 1-2-3 strategy? Because you will have one federal state, you'll have two constituent states with two communities controlling each of the two constituent states. You'll also have two education systems, you'll have two leaders of the two communities, and you'll have a bi-communal constitutional and political culture. Why 3? Well, you'll have 3 states, the federal state, the Greek Cypriot state, and the Turkish Cypriot state. You'll have 3 structures of government, 3 judiciaries, 3 parliaments, 3 executives, branches of government. You'll have 3 public sectors, you'll have 3 sets of public services. And you will have, as a consequence, a bloated public sector, which will fly in the face of one of the lessons of recent economic history, which is that a sovereign state should ideally have a lean and effective public sector. So, to sum up, what I've tried to do is just summarise to you in the limited time available what is meant by a Turkish grand strategy, what is meant by the doctrine of division that Turkey has been pushing for far too long. And what I've also tried to do to you is show that this is something which is very, very dangerous, not just for the Republic of Cyprus, but for the remainder of the European Union and the rest of the democratic world. And why is it dangerous? It really boils down to this. In the liberal democracies of the world today, do we want to establish a precedent within the European Union which accepts, recognises and promotes the constitutional separation of Christians from Muslims? Do we really want, in this day and age, to be recognising and supporting the separation of Christians from Muslims on a constitutional level? First question. Secondly, do we really want, in the democratic world of which the island of Cyprus supposedly forms part, do we really want to sanction the separation of Christians, of Muslims from Christians by means of two separate zones, one of which is to be governed by Turks and thus Muslims, and another governed by Greeks and thus Christians? Do we really want to establish principles of zonality within the constitutional philosophy of a member state of the European Union? What effect will this have upon the advocates of division elsewhere in the European Union? I mean, these are just some of the questions that I would invite everybody to think about. I'll leave you with this thought. It's a rather a telling thought. If you do not want to face a future in which Christians are separated from Muslims into two separate communities, if you want a future in which Muslims are not separated from Christians by means of two separate zones, you have to act like a citizen, and you have to campaign, and you have to demonstrate within the law. But you have to demonstrate, you have to campaign, you have to lobby, and you have to do what Prime Minister David Cameron suggested back in 2011. He said, we must exert what he called muscular liberalism. That's what needs to happen across the campuses of the world, across the houses and the families of the Republic of Cyprus and the rest of the European Union. There needs to be an exertion of muscular liberalism within the law and in the spirit of democracy, and with the view to ensuring that everybody in society, Greek, Turkish, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Jew, Hindu, Sikh, atheist, etc., everybody is equal under the law. Everybody is treated with dignity, and everybody, and I mean everybody, obeys the law and the cherished values of enlightened liberal democracy. Because if the principles and values of enlightened liberal democracy are crushed in one part of the European Union, I wonder how long it will take before they are crushed in other parts of the European Union. So I ask the question, is Cyprus a bulwark standing up for democracy, or a domino whose fall might spell the end of democracy? I'll let you answer that question. Thank you for listening.